Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we travel to the northeastern United States, to a quiet and heavily forested region of Vermont, where the landscape is known for its rolling hills, dense woods, and long stretches of wilderness that can feel untouched by time. Within this region lies an area that has quietly gained a reputation over the years for something far more unsettling. It is often referred to as the Bennington Triangle. Unlike better-known locations tied to mystery, the Bennington Triangle is not defined by clear borders or official recognition. Instead, it is a name given to a stretch of land surrounding the town of Bennington, extending into the surrounding mountains and forests.
At first glance, the area appears peaceful. Quiet roads wind through trees, hiking trails pass through thick forest, and small communities sit scattered across the landscape. Yet beneath this calm setting, a series of unexplained disappearances took place during the mid-20th century.
Between the 1940s and early 1950s, several individuals vanished within this region under circumstances that investigators struggled to explain. Some disappeared while walking along familiar paths. Others vanished in broad daylight, sometimes within sight of other people. In certain cases, search efforts began almost immediately, yet no clear trace of the missing individuals was ever found. Over time, these incidents became connected through patterns and proximity, leading to the area being described as a kind of triangle where multiple unexplained events had occurred. The stories surrounding the Bennington Triangle have continued to grow over the decades. Some view the disappearances as the result of natural hazards within the wilderness. Others believe the events may point to something more unusual. Tonight, we will explore the geography of this region, the individual cases that shaped its reputation, and the various explanations that have been proposed to understand what happened there. So settle in, allow the quiet rhythm of the night to slow your thoughts, and let the story begin as we step into the forests of Vermont and the enduring mystery of the Bennington Triangle. The region known as the Bennington Triangle is not marked on official maps, yet it is generally understood to center around the town of Bennington in the southwestern part of Vermont. From there, it extends outward into a broad area of wilderness that includes forests, hills, and remote mountain terrain. One of the most important geographical features within this region is Glastenbury Mountain. Rising above the surrounding landscape, the mountain is covered in dense forest and has long been known for its isolated and rugged environment. The terrain throughout this area can be difficult to navigate, especially for those unfamiliar with the landscape. Thick woods, uneven ground, and limited visibility make it easy for hikers to lose their sense of direction. In many parts of the forest, trails are either faint or disappear entirely. Even experienced outdoorsmen can find it challenging to maintain a clear path through the wilderness. Weather conditions in Vermont can also change quickly. Fog can roll in across the mountains, reducing visibility to only a few meters. Sudden drops in temperature or unexpected storms can make travel even more difficult. During the mid-20th century, when many of the disappearances occurred, the region was even less developed than it is today. Fewer roads and limited communication meant that once someone entered the wilderness, they were largely on their own. The forests surrounding Glastenbury Mountain are part of a larger system of wilderness areas that stretch across the northeastern United States. These forests are home to wildlife, streams, and remote valleys that remain largely untouched. Some parts of the region were once home to small logging communities. Over time, many of these settlements were abandoned, leaving behind only traces of human activity hidden within the trees. The isolation of these areas contributes to their atmosphere. When walking through the forest, it is possible to go long distances without encountering another person. Sound behaves differently in such environments. Wind moving through trees, distant animal calls, and the natural creaking of branches can create an unfamiliar auditory experience. For those who are not accustomed to such surroundings, these conditions can sometimes lead to confusion or disorientation. It is within this quiet and complex landscape that several unexplained disappearances took place during the 1940s and 1950s. The geography of the Bennington Triangle plays an important role in understanding these events. The dense forests, changing weather, and isolated terrain create conditions where even small mistakes can have serious consequences. Yet, while these natural factors provide one possible explanation, they do not fully account for all aspects of the cases that occurred in this region. As we move forward, we will begin examining the first of these disappearances, a case that marked the beginning of the mystery associated with the Bennington Triangle. Long before the disappearances that would later define the Bennington Triangle, the region surrounding Bennington had already developed a quiet and complex history shaped by isolation, industry, and the natural landscape. The town of Bennington, located in the southwestern corner of Vermont, is one of the oldest settlements in the state. Established during the 18th century, it became an important early community connected to agriculture, trade, and regional development. Beyond the town itself, however, the surrounding land was far more remote. Thick forests stretched across the hills and mountains, with only scattered paths and small settlements breaking through the wilderness. One of the most significant areas within this region was Glastenbury, a settlement that once existed near Glastenbury Mountain. During the 19th century, Glastenbury was a small but active logging community. Logging camps and rail lines were established to transport timber through the forests. Workers lived in temporary or semi-permanent settlements, carving out small pockets of activity within the otherwise quiet wilderness. However, life in these remote communities was difficult. Harsh weather, limited access to supplies, and the physical demands of logging made the area challenging to inhabit. Over time, as the logging industry declined and resources became less accessible, many of these settlements were gradually abandoned. Glastenbury itself eventually became a ghost town, leaving behind only traces of its existence hidden within the forest. This pattern of abandonment contributed to the isolated nature of the region. As fewer people lived in the surrounding areas, large sections of land returned to an almost untouched state. Local stories and folklore also began to develop around these remote landscapes. In many rural communities, unexplained events or unusual experiences were sometimes shared as part of oral tradition. Some accounts described people becoming lost in the woods under strange circumstances, while others spoke of unusual sounds or movements deep within the forest. Although such stories were often passed down informally and varied over time, they added a layer of mystery to the already quiet and isolated environment. By the early 20th century, much of the land surrounding Bennington had become sparsely populated. Trails existed for hikers and outdoorsmen, but large portions of the wilderness remained difficult to access. This combination of history, abandonment, and isolation created the setting in which the later disappearances would occur. When individuals began vanishing within this region during the 1940s, the events seemed to echo the earlier stories of people becoming lost in the woods. Yet the circumstances of these disappearances would soon raise questions that extended beyond ordinary explanations. Beginning with the case of an experienced outdoorsman who vanished without leaving a clear trace. The first widely recognized disappearance connected to the Bennington Triangle occurred in November of 1945, when an experienced outdoorsman named Middie Rivers vanished while leading a group through the wilderness. Rivers was a local hunting and fishing guide who knew the forests around Glastenbury Mountain extremely well. He had spent years navigating the terrain, guiding visitors through the woods, and helping hunters move safely through the region. On the day of his disappearance, Rivers was accompanying a small group of hunters through the forest. The group was traveling along a familiar route, and nothing about the situation initially seemed unusual. As they made their way through the wooded landscape, Rivers walked slightly ahead of the others, as a guide typically would. He was leading the group toward their destination, moving confidently through terrain he had traveled many times before. At one point, Rivers moved out of sight of the group briefly, as the path curved through the trees. This was not uncommon, especially in dense forests where visibility can be limited. However, when the group reached the point where they expected to see him again, Rivers was no longer there. At first, the hunters assumed he had simply taken a different route or paused ahead on the trail. They called out his name and waited for a response, expecting him to reappear. When no response came, concern began to grow. The group searched the immediate area, calling out repeatedly and looking for any sign of where he might have gone. Despite their efforts, there was no indication of his direction. There were no clear footprints leading away from the trail, and no signs that he had fallen or been injured nearby. Authorities were soon notified, and a search operation began. Given Rivers' experience and familiarity with the land, investigators initially believed he would likely be found quickly. Search teams combed the surrounding forest, covering large areas of terrain in an attempt to locate any trace of the missing guide. During the search, only one small clue was discovered. A rifle cartridge believed to belong to Rivers was found in the area. Beyond that, no clear evidence of his movements was uncovered. Days passed without any further discoveries. The forest remained quiet, and no signs of Rivers were found despite extensive efforts. For many investigators, the most puzzling aspect of the case was Rivers' experience. He was not unfamiliar with the terrain, and it seemed unlikely that he would simply become lost under normal circumstances. Yet, despite the search, Middie Rivers was never found. His disappearance marked the beginning of a series of events that would later be connected to the Bennington Triangle, raising questions about how someone so familiar with the land could vanish without leaving a trace. 1 year after the disappearance of Middie Rivers, another case would bring even greater attention to the region. In December of 1946, a college student named Paula Jean Welden vanished under circumstances that were witnessed, yet never fully understood. Welden was a student at Bennington College, located near the town of Bennington. She was described as a thoughtful and responsible young woman with a strong interest in nature and the outdoors. On December 1st, 1946, Welden decided to go for a walk along a well-known hiking route called the Long Trail. The trail passed through wooded areas near Glastenbury Mountain and was commonly used by hikers. That afternoon, she was seen by several individuals as she walked along the trail. Witnesses later recalled seeing her dressed in a bright red coat, moving calmly along the path. At one point, a couple walking behind her noticed that she had turned a bend in the trail ahead of them. When they reached the same point only moments later, Welden was no longer visible. The trail itself did not offer many places where someone could easily disappear within seconds. The surrounding forest was dense, but there were no obvious signs that she had left the path. The couple assumed she had simply continued walking and moved further ahead. However, as they continued along the trail, they were unable to find any sign of her. When Welden did not return to her dormitory later that evening, concern quickly grew. Authorities were notified, and a large search operation was organized. Search teams, including local volunteers and law enforcement, began combing the area around the Long Trail. Dogs were brought in to track her scent, and aircraft were used to survey the surrounding wilderness. Despite these efforts, no trace of Welden was ever found. There were no footprints leading away from the trail, no personal belongings left behind, and no confirmed sightings after the moment she disappeared around the bend. The case attracted widespread attention at the time. Newspapers across the region reported on the disappearance, and the mystery became one of the most talked about cases in Vermont. Unlike the disappearance of Middie Rivers, which had occurred in a more remote setting, Welden's case involved multiple witnesses who had seen her shortly before she vanished. This detail made the event particularly unsettling. She had been walking along a familiar trail in daylight, within view of others, and yet she seemed to have disappeared within moments. The search eventually ended without answers. Paula Jean Welden was never found, and her case remains unsolved. Her disappearance strengthened the growing sense that something unusual was happening in the forests surrounding Bennington, adding another layer to the developing mystery of the Bennington Triangle. By the late 1940s, the disappearances connected to the Bennington Triangle had already begun to attract attention. Yet the next case would stand apart from the others in a particularly unusual way. In 1949, a man named James Tedford reportedly vanished under circumstances that did not involve deep forest or remote hiking trails. Tedford was a military veteran who had been staying at a home for veterans. On the day of his disappearance, he boarded a bus traveling toward the town of Bennington. According to witness accounts, Tedford was seen sitting in his seat during the journey. Other passengers later recalled noticing him as the bus made its scheduled stops along the route. The trip itself appeared routine. The bus followed a normal path, and there were no reports of unusual disturbances during the journey. As the bus approached its destination, however, something unexpected was discovered. When the vehicle arrived in Bennington and passengers began preparing to leave, Tedford was no longer in his seat. At first, this might have seemed like a simple case of a passenger disembarking earlier along the route. However, several details made the situation far more puzzling. Witnesses who had been on the bus stated that they had not seen Tedford leave at any of the stops. According to their accounts, he had remained seated during the journey. When investigators examined the situation, they found that Tedford's personal belongings were still present on the bus. His luggage and other items had been left behind, suggesting that he had not planned to leave voluntarily. There were no reports of the bus stopping unexpectedly, and no evidence that Tedford had exited the vehicle between scheduled stops. This raised a difficult question. If he had not left the bus at any of the stops, and his belongings remained behind, how had he disappeared? Unlike the previous cases connected to the Bennington Triangle, this disappearance did not take place deep within the wilderness. Instead, it occurred within the controlled environment of a moving vehicle, surrounded by other passengers. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the journey and determine whether any details had been overlooked. However, no clear explanation emerged. Some suggested that witness accounts might have been mistaken or incomplete. Others proposed that Tedford may have left the bus without being noticed. Yet even these explanations did not fully account for the presence of his belongings or the lack of any confirmed sighting after the journey. The case of James Tedford added a new dimension to the growing mystery. It suggested that the unusual events associated with the Bennington Triangle might not be limited to the forest alone, raising further questions about what could have caused these disappearances. By the year 1950, the region surrounding the Bennington Triangle had already been associated with several unexplained disappearances. Yet the next case would be particularly unsettling because it involved a young child. The child was Paul Jean, a boy who lived with his family near the town of Bennington. His parents worked on a local farm, and like many children growing up in rural areas, Paul was familiar with the surrounding environment. On the day of his disappearance, Paul had been playing near his mother while she worked. At one point, she briefly stepped away, leaving him alone for a short period of time. When she returned, Paul was no longer there. At first, his absence may have seemed like a simple situation where a child had wandered a short distance away. However, as time passed and no sign of him appeared, concern quickly grew. Search efforts began almost immediately. Local residents, volunteers, and authorities joined together to comb the surrounding fields and wooded areas. Because Paul was a young child, the search was focused on areas close to where he had last been seen. Investigators believed he would not have traveled far on his own. Tracking dogs were brought in to follow his scent. According to reports, the dogs traced his path toward a nearby wooded area before losing the trail. This detail suggested that Paul may have entered the forest shortly before disappearing. However, no further clues were found beyond that point. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of Paul Jeppson was ever discovered. There were no footprints, no clothing, and no clear evidence indicating what had happened. Some investigators considered the possibility that the child may have become lost in the woods and succumbed to the environment. However, the complete absence of physical evidence made this explanation difficult to confirm. Others speculated about the involvement of another person, but there was no clear indication that anyone else had been present in the area at the time. One detail that later drew attention was the location where the tracking dogs lost Paul's scent. It was near a wooded area connected to the same broader region where previous disappearances had occurred. This connection contributed to the growing perception that the incidents might be linked in some way. The disappearance of Paul Jeppson added a deeply emotional element to the mystery. Unlike the earlier cases, which involved adults navigating the wilderness, this event involved a child who vanished within a very short period of time. As with the previous disappearances, the case remained unsolved. No definitive explanation was ever found. The final major case, often associated with the Bennington Triangle, occurred later in 1950 and introduced a new and unusual detail to the pattern of disappearances. The case involved Frida Lange, an experienced outdoors enthusiast who was familiar with the wilderness around Glastenbury Mountain. On the day of her disappearance, Lange had been hiking with a group in the forest. During the hike, she slipped while crossing a stream and fell into the water. Although she was not seriously injured, her clothes became wet. She decided to return to the nearby camp to change into dry clothing. Lange left the group and began making her way back along a route she knew. Because she was familiar with the area, there was no immediate concern about her traveling alone. However, when she failed to return to the group or arrive back at the camp, concern quickly began to grow. Search efforts were organized soon after her disappearance. Teams of volunteers and authorities combed the surrounding forest, retracing her path and examining the areas she was most likely to have passed through. Despite these efforts, no trace of her was found during the initial search. The forest seemed to offer no clear indication of where she had gone. What made this case particularly unusual was what happened next. Several months later, her body was discovered in an area that had already been searched multiple times during the earlier efforts. This discovery raised immediate questions. The location where she was found had been carefully examined during the search, yet no trace of her had been detected at the time. Investigators were unable to determine exactly how or when her body had appeared in that location. Because of the condition of the remains, it was also difficult to establish a precise cause of death. Unlike the previous disappearances connected to the Bennington Triangle, this case did not involve a complete absence of evidence. Instead, it introduced a different kind of mystery. If the area had already been searched thoroughly, how had her body not been found earlier? With this case, the pattern of disappearances in the Bennington Triangle reached its most complete form, leaving behind a collection of events that would continue to raise questions for decades to come. By the early 1950s, the series of disappearances connected to the Bennington Triangle had formed a pattern that investigators and observers began examining more closely, although each case involved different individuals and circumstances. Certain similarities appeared when the events were viewed together. One of the most noticeable patterns was the location. All of the disappearances occurred within or near the same general region surrounding Bennington and the forested areas around Glastenbury Mountain. This geographical concentration led many to believe that the environment itself might play a role in the events. Another pattern involved the nature of the individuals who disappeared. In several cases, the missing people were familiar with the outdoors. Middie Rivers was an experienced guide who knew the terrain well. Frida Lange was also familiar with hiking in the area. This made their disappearances particularly difficult to explain, since they were not inexperienced travelers who might easily become lost. The timing of the events also drew attention. Many of the disappearances occurred during the late fall and early winter months. when weather conditions in Vermont can become colder and more unpredictable. Shorter daylight hours, lower temperatures, and the possibility of sudden weather changes could all increase the risks associated with traveling in the wilderness. Another detail noted by some researchers was the suddenness of the disappearances. In several cases, individuals vanished within a very short period of time. Paula Jean Welden was last seen walking along a trail and disappeared within minutes. Paul Jepson vanished during a brief moment when he was left unattended. These rapid disappearances created a sense that something unexpected had occurred rather than a gradual series of events. In most of the cases, there were also very few physical clues left behind. Search teams often found no clear trails, footprints, or belongings that could explain where the individuals had gone. This absence of evidence made it difficult for investigators to reconstruct the final movements of those who disappeared. Some observers also pointed out that the cases occurred within a relatively short period of time, mainly between 1945 and 1950. This concentration of events within a 5-year span contributed to the idea that the disappearances might be connected in some way. Despite these similarities, there were also important differences between the cases. For example, the disappearance of James Tedford did not occur in the forest itself, but on a bus traveling toward Bennington. This detail complicated attempts to explain the events using a single theory. When viewed together, the cases present a combination of patterns and inconsistencies. The shared location, timing, and suddenness of the disappearances suggest possible connections, while the differences between them make it difficult to apply a single explanation. These patterns would later influence the theories developed to explain the Bennington Triangle, as researchers attempted to determine whether the events were related, or simply a series of coincidences within a challenging natural environment. As the stories surrounding the Bennington Triangle continued to grow, many investigators and researchers began focusing on more grounded explanations rooted in the natural environment. While the disappearances felt unusual when viewed together, the wilderness of Vermont presents a number of real challenges that can easily lead to dangerous situations. The forests surrounding Glastenbury Mountain are dense, uneven, and often disorienting. Thick vegetation can limit visibility, making it difficult to maintain a clear sense of direction, even over short distances. Trails that appear obvious at one moment can fade quickly, especially during colder months when leaves fall and landmarks become harder to recognize. For someone moving through the woods, it is possible to unknowingly drift away from a path without realizing it. Weather conditions in this region can also shift rapidly, particularly during late autumn and early winter, when several of the disappearances occurred. Temperatures can drop quickly, daylight fades earlier, and fog or light snowfall can reduce visibility even further. In such conditions, even an experienced outdoorsman can become disoriented or lose track of direction, especially if separated from a group. Search and rescue experts often point out that when people become lost in wilderness environments, they do not always behave in predictable ways. Disorientation can lead individuals to make decisions that unintentionally take them deeper into unfamiliar terrain. In some cases, people may circle back toward areas they have already passed without realizing it, making it more difficult for search teams to locate them. Another important factor is the difficulty of conducting searches in such terrain. Even large search teams covering wide areas can miss small details. Dense forests can conceal tracks, belongings, or even entire bodies, particularly if vegetation grows quickly, or if the terrain includes dips, rocks, and hidden spaces. This may help explain why, in the case of Frida Langer, her body was later discovered in an area that had already been searched. Wildlife and natural hazards may also play a role in some situations, although there is limited direct evidence connecting such factors to the disappearances. The wilderness of Vermont contains steep terrain, streams, and uneven ground where a fall or injury could leave someone unable to move or call for help. In remote areas, Even a minor injury can become serious if assistance is not immediately available. The disappearance of James Tedford presents a different challenge for this explanation, since it did not occur within the forest itself. However, some researchers suggest that this case may not be directly connected to the others, even though it is often included in discussions of the Bennington Triangle. When viewed through this natural lens, the disappearances may represent a series of unfortunate events rather than a single unified mystery. Each case could involve different circumstances shaped by environment, timing, and individual decisions. Yet, even with these explanations, certain aspects remain difficult to fully account for. The suddenness of the disappearances, the lack of physical evidence, and the experience of some of the individuals involved continue to raise questions. This balance between explanation and uncertainty is what keeps the mystery alive. The natural environment of the Bennington Triangle offers many answers, but not all of them. As natural explanations attempted to account for the disappearances within the Bennington Triangle, other interpretations began to emerge that focused on folklore, local legends, and more unusual possibilities. Over time, these ideas became closely tied to the identity of the region, adding a deeper layer of mystery to the events. Long before the disappearances of the 1940s, the forests around Glastenbury Mountain had already been associated with unusual stories. Some accounts suggested that Native American communities who once lived in the area considered certain parts of the mountain to be avoided or treated with caution. While historical records are limited, these stories contributed to the idea that the land itself carried a certain presence. In more recent years, some observers have described the region as having unusual atmospheric qualities. Visitors have reported feelings of disorientation, sudden silence in the forest, or the sensation of being watched while walking through remote areas. These experiences are often subjective and difficult to measure, yet they have become part of the broader narrative surrounding the triangle. One of the more widely discussed theories involves the idea of unexplained forces or unknown phenomena within the wilderness. Some believe that the region could be associated with unusual energy patterns that affect perception or navigation. According to this view, individuals entering the forest may become disoriented in ways that are not entirely explained by environmental factors alone. Another theory draws comparisons to other locations around the world where multiple disappearances have occurred within a specific region. In these cases, some researchers have suggested the possibility of temporary missing zones, areas where individuals seem to vanish without leaving clear evidence behind. While there is no scientific confirmation of such phenomena, the idea continues to appear in discussions of unexplained disappearances. More speculative interpretations have linked the events to concepts such as dimensional shifts or portals, where individuals might unknowingly cross into an unseen boundary. These ideas remain within the realm of theory and are not supported by verified evidence, yet they continue to capture the imagination of those who study mysterious locations. The disappearance of James Tedford is often cited in support of these theories, because it does not easily fit into environmental explanations. His reported disappearance from a moving bus has led some to suggest that the phenomenon associated with the region may not be limited to the forest itself. Local legends have also played a role in shaping the story of the Bennington Triangle. Over time, accounts of unusual creatures, unexplained sounds, and strange sightings have been shared among residents and visitors. These stories often evolve as they are retold, blending historical events with imagination. It is important to approach these ideas with careful consideration. While they add depth to the mystery, many of the paranormal theories cannot be tested or confirmed through traditional investigation. They exist as interpretations rather than proven explanations. Still, the persistence of these stories reflects something meaningful about how people respond to unexplained events. When answers are incomplete, imagination often fills the gaps, creating narratives that attempt to make sense of uncertainty. The Bennington Triangle has become a place where history, environment, and folklore intersect. Whether the disappearances can be fully explained through natural causes, or whether something less understood may be involved, remains an open question. And it is this balance between explanation and mystery that continues to draw attention to the forests of Vermont. Decades have passed since the disappearances that came to define the Bennington Triangle, yet the mystery continues to hold a quiet place in American history. Unlike many cases that fade with time, the events in this region have remained present in books, documentaries, and conversations about unexplained phenomena. One reason for this lasting impact is the setting itself. The forests of Vermont are naturally atmospheric, with long stretches of wilderness that feel removed from modern life. Places like Glastenbury Mountain remain quiet and largely untouched, allowing the imagination to fill in the spaces between what is seen and what is unknown. The cases connected to the region also carry a certain emotional weight. Each disappearance involved a real person with a life, a routine, and a story that suddenly stopped without explanation. The absence of clear answers leaves a sense of incompleteness that continues to draw attention. Another reason the mystery endures is the combination of similarities and differences between the cases. There are patterns that suggest possible connections, such as location and timing. Yet each event also contains details that do not easily align with a single explanation. This balance creates a situation where no theory fully satisfies all aspects of the story. The passage of time has also contributed to the mystery. As years turn into decades, physical evidence becomes harder to recover, and first-hand accounts are lost. This makes it increasingly difficult to revisit the cases with new information, leaving many questions permanently unanswered. At the same time, the story of the Bennington Triangle has gradually become part of American folklore. It is often mentioned alongside other unexplained locations, representing the idea that even familiar landscapes can hold events that remain difficult to understand. The region around Bennington continues to exist as it always has, with forests, trails, and quiet mountain paths. For most visitors, it is simply a place of natural beauty and calm surroundings. Yet for those who know the history, the landscape carries an additional layer of meaning. It is a place where several individuals vanished under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The mystery does not rely on dramatic evidence or a single shocking event. Instead, it is built from a series of quiet disappearances that resist simple answers. This subtlety may be one of the reasons it remains so compelling. The Bennington Triangle does not present itself as something extraordinary at first glance. It appears ordinary, which makes the events connected to it feel even more unusual. Perhaps the enduring fascination comes from this contrast. A peaceful landscape, familiar and natural, becomes the setting for questions that remain unresolved. And in that contrast, the mystery continues to live on, not as a solved case, but as a reminder that even in the most quiet and ordinary places, there are stories that may never be fully understood. As our story gently comes to an end tonight, the forests surrounding the Bennington Triangle return to stillness. The mountains, trails, and quiet stretches of woodland remain as they have for generations, unchanged in appearance, yet carrying stories that continue to echo quietly through time. The region around Bennington is, to most, a place of natural beauty. The trees move softly with the wind, the paths wind through the hills, and the landscape offers a sense of calm that draws visitors each year. And yet, within that calm, a series of events unfolded that have never been fully explained. We have followed the stories of those who vanished, from experienced guide Middie Rivers to student Paula Jean Welden, to the unusual case of James Tedford and the disappearance of young Paul Jepson. Each case left behind questions. Some offer partial explanations through the challenges of the natural environment. Others remain more difficult to understand, with details that do not easily fit into a single theory. Over time, these events became connected, forming what is now known as the Bennington Triangle. Whether this connection represents a true pattern or simply a series of coincidences shaped by geography and time is something that may never be fully known. Perhaps the most lasting aspect of this story is not the mystery itself, but the quiet way it exists. There are no dramatic conclusions, no clear answers waiting to be uncovered. Instead, there is only the landscape, unchanged, and the memory of those who walked into it and were never seen again. If you found tonight's documentary.com more interesting, you are always welcome here. Subscribing to the channel and leaving a like helps support more long-form stories told in a peaceful and steady way. And now, as the night settles in, the forests of Vermont grow quiet once more. The wind moves through the trees, the paths remain still, and the mystery of the Bennington Triangle fades gently into the calm rhythm of sleep.